Scott Bevan, welcome to Booktopia.
Thanks so much, Caroline.
Has anyone ever asked you whether you would sit for a portrait for the Archibald?
No.
Would you?
Yes, I would. I have friends who are artists. I admire the way artists can show character, somehow get into character. You know, the author Paul Theroux says a picture's worth only 1,000 words. But I admire the fact, without words, the way a really good portrait can say so much. So I think with trepidation, I would say yes to a portraitist.
Okay, it's interesting because obviously we're going to talk about how portraiture exposes character, because that's absolutely at the heart of your wonderful biography of William Dobell. But I think the timing of your book is so interesting. I mean, it's obviously sheer coincidence, but at the moment we've got Eric Jensen's very sort of brutal exposing portrait of Adam Cullen. And then we've got your very loving, I think very gentle book about Dobell, and about a private Dobell that we may not have known about. And I was just really struck by the fact that Dobell was someone who shunned celebrity and found it all overwhelming. It caused a nervous breakdown after the controversy around the Joshua Smith portrait, whereas Adam Cullen just loved celebrity. Have you thought a little bit about that?
I spoke briefly to Eric about it, and I'm yet to read Eric's book, but I've read the extract and thought, oh my goodness, what a journey! It sounded like a wild journey, both for Adam and Eric, and so it is a totally different journey to that which I've undertaken with Bill Dobell's. I mean, it started gently, and somewhat, I guess, it was set by the man. I mean, he was a gentle man.
Yeah.
He was a man who possessed, which few people knew, a very quick wit. He was very sharp, and he was very complex, contrary to the public image of him of being simple. For the great portraitist, he presented a portrait of himself. The self-portrait that he wanted the world to see was one that was very simple, and one that was quite inscrutable.
Yes, and hid a few things which you in fact reveal, which I think are absolutely fascinating. How did you first become interested in him?
I've always known of Dobell because Dobell was a Newcastle boy. I'm a Newcastle boy. And Newcastle's one of those great centres where the tall poppy syndrome doesn't exist. It celebrates those who do well and excel. And even though Newcastle, particularly in Dobell's day, having been born in 1899 and growing up there, spending the first 20 odd years of his life there, this was a blue collar town. This was a town that was literally rising out of the marshes beside the Hunter River with the steelworks. It was fast becoming Steel City. It was a steel town, and that was imprinted as surely as the letters BHP was into those rods of iron coming out of there. This was a steel city. Yet, in spite of that, and in spite of the fact that as an artist he had to go elsewhere, Dobell and what he achieved was something that was celebrated. So ever since I was a kid, I would hear about William Dobell, and as a teenager I used to love riding into the suburb where the Newcastle Art Gallery was, a suburb called Cook's Hill, because this suburb had this otherness about it. It felt different to where I grew up. So I'd cycle in there, cycle to the gallery, and the painting that beguiled me more than any other, that drew me to look at it face to face, and for me to stop and really look at it, was Portrait of a Strapper, Bill Dobell's portrait from 41, and the first acquisition of the Newcastle Art Gallery.
Right, and then there was a more personal connection, wasn't there? Because you went to live somewhere that he had gone and found a kind of sanctuary after all the controversy, hadn't he? He'd found a haven at a place called
Wanji Wanji, which in one translation of the local people means a place of many waters. Because Wanji Wanji is this extraordinary little village that's sprinkled across a peninsula that juts out into Lake Macquarie. And it feels otherworldly. And there is just this constricted throat of land to get onto this point, into Wanji Wanji. It's the only way in, only way out. So that gives it that sense of otherness and that sense of otherworldliness. And it's a great place to escape to. It was then, as Bill discovered, and as my wife Jo and I discovered on a particularly rainy Sunday afternoon driving back to Sydney from Newcastle, from my hometown, we decided to detour to Wanji to see Dobell House. My wife's an artist, she wanted to see it. I wanted to see the place I'd visited when I was younger. And as we've told folks since, simplifying the story, we went to Wanji Wanji to see Dobell House. We drove away with a house. We fell in love with it. And it's got an overpowering but very gentle persuasiveness, Wanji. And by the time we'd walked around the shoreline and looked at the overturned rowboats under the casuarina trees, chained there like dogs, and then up into the shopping strip and thought, this looks like a country town. It had the feel of somewhere from some other time. Looked in the real estate window. By the time we peered in that window, we were done for. And what we felt in that first impression of this being like another place from another time, a community, turned out to be true. But the one way to shut down a conversation quickly with a long-time Wanjiite was to say, did you know Bill Dobell? Or tell me about Bill Dobell. And they'd sort of look away and they'd come out with a few pat lines, or they'd come out with a riddle whereby they'd say, those who knew Dobell wouldn't say that. The only people who would say that are those who are happy to say they knew Dobell, but they didn't know Dobell. And you'd be like, I don't know what you meant, but anyway. We started to get to know Wanji better because we learned to observe. The great gift of Bill Dobell's, the great gift of any artist, is that they teach you to observe. And it was through his landscapes of Wanji that we began to see Wanji, to see the Wanji he came to paint and came to escape to, and the Wanji we were in. And I guess because we started to understand Wanji through our observations and get to know the rhythm and character of the place, long-term Wanjiites started to speak to us.
Okay, so let's talk about the central episode, the drama that he's fleeing when he comes to Wanji. You recreate the courtroom drama that ensues from the controversy of the Archibald Prize brilliantly. But can you just take us through that? Because I have to say that for me now, I find it almost impossible to believe that a portrait could cause that kind of a stir. So what happened?
I know, it's extraordinary. And when you think about the times as well, I mean, the nation had bigger things to worry about. We were at war. And in the midst of the Second World War, for art to manage to push conflict off the front pages, maybe art wars are even bigger than a Second World War, I don't know. But yeah, Dobell had always had, this was a portrait born out of friendship, the portrait of Joshua Smith. Someone who looked up to Dobell as an artist and became good friends with Dobell. They were both serving in the Allied Works Council as labourers and camouflage painters during the war. They shared a tent and they shared their love of art in the midst of doing all the other things they had to do. In the midst of the conflict, they shared art. They sketched each other, they drew each other, and Bill ended up working up sketches into a portrait of Joshua, that famous portrait. Bill always had reservations about it, but Bill had reservations about anything he painted. He appeared to be always on tenterhooks about what he was doing and how people would respond to it. But he did end up putting it into the Archibald Prize, and it won. It wasn't unanimous, apparently, in that room. The trustees argued about it. Some expressed their concerns even at that point. Is this a portrait? That question. Is this a portrait? This is what resonated through the papers, through the halls of the gallery, out into the wider community. And everyone had an opinion. Everyone arrived at an answer, their own answer to that question. Is this a portrait? That meant everyone wanted to look at this work, but what worried Bill was everyone was starting to look at him. And then this turned into a court case because two aggrieved artists, in effect, took the trustees to court to contest whether they should have even awarded this prize, this portrait the prize, because it's not a portrait, it's a caricature. The trustees had to defend their decision. Dobell had to defend what he had created. Dobell had to defend what he did. Dobell had to defend, in effect, who he was, who he devoted his adult life to.
Well, more than that, he had to defend portraiture, I think.
Yeah, you're right.
Really?
Yeah, it was an extraordinary case.
Did you have a clear opinion, I mean, because you were writing a sympathetic biography of him, did you have a clear opinion from the get-go that you were on the side of Dobell and portraiture, or were you ambivalent and in the course of your research you sort of cemented a view?
It was difficult because I had never seen the original work, of course. It was destroyed in a fire. and then it was restored.
But badly restored.
And that broke many people's hearts, and including Joshua Smith. He didn't like it either. So I wasn't coming at it from saying, well, I've seen that portrait, so this is my opinion of it. I didn't have that advantage. So I wasn't ambivalent, but nor was I set in my ways of going, yeah, Dobell has painted a portrait here. I was interested to explore the arguments on both sides. And it is fascinating to see that, to follow those byways and those arguments.
Heated. I mean, it was
So
heated, it was bitter,
Yeah.
it was painful,
Yeah.
it divided friendships, it ruined friendships. It had a really, really corrosive and enduring kind of legacy. It tarnished the Archibald in some way as well, possibly.
Certainly attracted more attention to the Archibald, and it's never let that go.
No, well, that's true. One of the things that I found so fascinating about your book is to discover that he nearly painted Miles Franklin.
Yeah. Yeah.
And about his relationship with Patrick White.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's pretty juicy.
But it was, yeah. Well, certainly Patrick loved the story that led to the Ham funeral. This extraordinary painting that Bill did on an experience when he lived for almost a decade in London on this particular time, where his landlady was distressed and knocked on his door and said, "Can you come and help me with my husband who had died?" And that she then asked Bill to go and let relatives and loved ones know he was going to get a proper send-off, he was going to have a Ham funeral. And Dobell did tell this story to Patrick White, and they did become friends. And from the distance of half a century, you can see how these two guys did become friends when they both came back to Australia. In post-war Australia, how these two fellows did connect. Very different characters, very different backgrounds, working in different mediums, but in so many ways it all intersected between the artist and the writer, and certainly it seems as though on at least one occasion they were more than friends.
Yes, that's very, very tantalising, and I just don't know whether I believe it or not, but it's just one of many sort of really fascinating insights in this really wonderful book. So thank you very much, Scott Bevan.
Thank you.